So hello everybody. Today we'll be speaking to another author from the forthcoming book, Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission, which is edited by Dr. Anthony Reddie and myself. And today we'll be hearing from Al Barrett, who co-wrote his chapter with Ruth Harley, and we'll be speaking to Ruth another time. But today we're speaking to Al Barrett, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about his chapter. So, hello, Al.
Hi.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. So I'm an Anglican priest in the Church of England. I've been rector of Hodge Hill in East Birmingham for the last 13 years and been ordained for about 20 years. I am also involved in a long-term journey of community building on our estate locally as part of my work here. And in kind of cracks in my spare time, I write and read and occasionally teach around various areas, but include whiteness and mission, and more recently ecology in various ways as well. And I'm writing a chapter on masculinity with a Methodist colleague at the moment as well. So I'm interested in a whole load of intersectional stuff, but this chapter certainly was something that was really exciting to write with Ruth.
Oh, that's good to hear. So, could you briefly describe what your chapter's about?
Sure, yeah. So we've called it Holding the Space, Troubling the Facilitating Obsession of Whiteness in Contemporary Social Justice Focused Models of Mission, which is a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully the various bits of that title are helpful and sort of highlight something of what we're talking about. We picked up on a phrase of Willie James Jennings in his recent book After Whiteness, where he describes the facilitating obsession of whiteness. And he describes it in the context of theological education. And he uses the word facilitating, I think, in kind of metaphorical terms in some ways. But we kind of wanted to take him literally and ask the question, what is it about the urge to facilitate? And what is it about ways of facilitating that are potentially coloured for those of us racialized as white by our whiteness? And so that's what we try and explore in the chapter, and we explore it within that context of those of us racialized as white wanting to do social justice or be involved in social justice as mission. And it kind of builds for us on work that we've done before, Ruth and I, particularly our book Being Interrupted, Reimagining the Church's Mission from the Outside In, where one of the images that we pick up on is this idea of a busy activist social justice Jesus. And the temptation for those of us racialized as white to identify with Jesus, to ask the what would Jesus do question, to put ourselves in Jesus's shoes, and to place ourselves into roles of provider or advocate, particularly kind of speaking on behalf of others, or providing stuff for others. We reflected a bit in the book also on the dynamic of guest and host, and where the host often has more power and a role that's often tempting for those of us who are white. And kind of wanted to build on those roles and kind of look at the space of facilitation, which often sounds like it's a bit more soft and cuddly, and maybe a bit more neutral in terms of power, but actually wanted to ask the question, what are the dangers of putting ourselves in the facilitation role if we are entangled in the structures of white supremacy, and if we're racialized as white ourselves? So we kind of try and unpick some of the risks, some of the dangers, and try and offer some proposals for moving beyond good white facilitation.
Okay. I suppose you partly answered the question already, but what made you take that kind of approach?
So I guess we were wanting to ask some self-critical questions of our own work. We're both parish priests who get called on to facilitate conversations within our own church context quite often. My work also in the wider community here involves a fair amount of sort of facilitating kind of roles. And I think increasingly for both of us, because of our writing, we've been asked to enter into other spaces to speak, but also to facilitate as well. So I think it started with a really personal, self-critical, reflexive kind of approach of wanting to say, what about what we are finding ourselves doing ourselves is risky? What is dangerous? What do we need to attend to that maybe is in the periphery of our attention at the moment? And how can we work to reduce those risks and dangers in the work that we do? And actually, are there circumstances where actually the invitation to facilitate is one that we should be saying no to instead of so it started as kind of a self-critical, reflexive place, but inevitably we go on to ask some questions of others who might occupy similar spaces. And one of the case studies we use towards the end is of a recent book by Archbishop Justin Welby, the current Archbishop of Canterbury, who wrote a book recently on reconciliation, which at its most dangerous, we would want to say, risks suggesting that actually white people in positions of structural power and privilege might be well placed to facilitate things that actually we really shouldn't be facilitating. And one of the examples Justin Welby uses in the book is the example of racial justice and racial injustice and what he calls racial reconciliation. And we try and unpick some of the assumptions that he's working with in that book, and suggest that certainly a white person in a position of power shouldn't be going anywhere near expecting to be able to facilitate racial reconciliation, where those of us who are white are actually deeply implicated in the injustice and need to be showing up as white people, as protagonists in the injustice rather than as supposedly neutral facilitators.
Yeah, interesting point. So I suppose leading on from that, what has shaped your social conscience, particularly in terms of issues like race and inclusivity?
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you. So it's probably fairly obvious that I'm racialized as white. It might be obvious or slightly less obvious that I'm inextricably middle class. It's probably fairly obvious that I'm male. And actually, when you go through various dimensions of structural privilege and forms of injustice and domination in society, I tick pretty much all the boxes of being on the privileged side of those imbalances. And I think, so I'm 47, I would say I've been a slow learner on some of that stuff and maybe less slow on others. I was formed in mission initially by USPG through a scheme they ran called Root Groups in the late 90s, and was living and working in Salford in Greater Manchester for a year just after I'd graduated from Cambridge University with an astrophysics degree. And I think probably that was the first wake-up call to an awareness of some of my multiple privileges, particularly around class, and really it was a penny drop moment in terms of what mission and Christian ministry might look like for someone like me, from a privileged middle class background, going into an area like Salford, and certainly the neighbourhood that we were in Salford was an area that had
Hello.
sorry, that was my cat saying hello. Yeah, an area that historically had serious kind of economic deprivation. Um, and we were formed very explicitly with an attitude of going in not to save, not to fix, not to help, but going to live, to make our home in a place where our primary vocation was to get to know our neighbours, to listen, to make friends, and to learn. Actually, primarily more than anything, it was a year of learning from our neighbours and learning in the neighbourhoods where we found ourselves. And that was deeply transformative for me. The year in Salford as part of a small Christian community that shared a house together with our neighbours, with the local Methodist church. Not really bringing much ourselves in the way of gifts and skills and expertise other than empty hands and open ears. And certainly that has shaped a lot of my attitude to ministry since then. And certainly it was foundational of my approach when I arrived in Hodge Hill as vicar here 13 years ago. So I would say class I've been more conscious of for a while. But in terms of race and racial injustice, I've begun to say recently that I was in my 40s before I truly realised that I was white.
Yeah, I read a piece you've done on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wrote a blog post fairly recently on that for Modern Church. And really, again, a penny drop moment for that was 2 or 3 years after having arrived here as vicar. In a church where I was really consciously wanting to shape the culture so that many voices were heard, so that many people were participating in worship. But it was a conversation with a Black African Caribbean member of the congregation over a meal at her house, where she told me a story of being told that her ministry was no longer needed or required in this church congregation some 2 decades before I arrived as vicar, and of how that had changed the way she felt able to show up at church. And up until that point, I had known her only really as someone who tended to turn up after the service had started and leave as soon as the service was over, and I'd rarely had a conversation with. And she said to me, that thing that you've been doing at the start of the service, where you ask us to talk to our neighbour and share something of what we're thankful for and what we turn up with to church that weighs heavily on us, and then you invite us to share some of those out loud with other people. That was the first time I've been able to speak in church for about 20 years. And I think that came as a shock because of how painful that encounter, a few decades ago had been with a previous minister who had told her that she wasn't valued or needed, and the horror of that. But it came as a shock more so that I'd been vicar there for 2 or 3 years, and I hadn't realised that was some of the history that people had. I hadn't realised that there were people in my congregation, particularly people from a Black African Caribbean background, who had been structurally silenced within this congregation for a long time. And it was the realizing that I hadn't seen it that really kind of hit home for me, and realizing that some of the privilege of whiteness is to be able to breeze through life not seeing stuff that my siblings can't help but see from day to day. And so I think, and it's what Ruth and I in our work call obliviousness. We try and avoid language of blindness and blind spots for obvious reasons to do with ableism. But that sense of obliviousness, of kind of not stuff that we don't perceive. And I guess that's one of the things in our chapter, less in terms of what we see and more in terms of what we hear and don't hear, and what we unintentionally don't allow to be said in conversations by our presence or by the way we use our power, that we wanted to explore a bit further. What are the dynamics in a space that has white people, but also people of a global majority heritage background? When there's a white person facilitating, what is not spoken in the room because of that? What is not heard? What is not able to be expressed? Or what is expressed in different ways that are that might go under the radar of somebody like me?
Thank you for that. Leading on from that, then, what do you think are the biggest challenges that face the church and the wider society in terms of creating frameworks for issues of social justice?
Sure. Well, as I said in my introduction, I'm an Anglican priest in the Church of England. And so when I talk about the church, that tends to be where I start. Very conscious that there are plenty of other churches out there, but this is the denomination I know best.
Yeah.
And I think for the Church of England right now, there is a major challenge to do with whiteness and empire and mission. Those subheadings of the book that we've all contributed to. And that's a challenge about our history and acknowledging our denomination's entanglement with empire, as the established church in England for many centuries, its role both at home in terms of perpetuating and entrenching establishment and institutions of power that have been dominated by and shaped by and deformed by whiteness, as well as by class, and also our involvement in the transatlantic slave trade as entangled with the kind of colonizing mission of the Church of England in other parts of the world. So there's a whole load of history that I think we've barely begun to face and acknowledge. But that history, as ever, works itself out in the present as well. So I think there's a whole load of questions around reparations for that history and how its ongoing legacy is experienced. But I think there are huge questions for the Church of England around its ongoing attachment to privilege and establishment, and entanglement with the corridors of power in a country where white supremacy is not spoken of, but is in action from day to day. The fact that we as a denomination expect to be heard in the corridors of power, expect to kind of have a cozy relationship with those who govern, in effect neuters our voice in being able to raise prophetic challenge. And even when our archbishops and bishops do so, they do it often in a way that you can tell is constantly worried about who they might offend or what relationships they might damage because of what they say. So I think there's a whole load of stuff about us structurally and denominationally for the Church of England that is a huge challenge right now. And I think that cashes out not just in terms of whiteness and racial injustice, but also profoundly in terms of class. We're a very middle class denomination. Maybe we're not quite the Tory party at prayer that we were described as a few years ago, but there's certainly a fair amount of that still. But it means that in local communities as well, particularly in communities that are economically deprived, communities that have been asset stripped, communities where the abundance of gifts and talents and skills and knowledge and wisdom locally has been suppressed by the way our economic and social structures work. Actually, even there, we're often an outsider to the reality of life. We're often a provider, and as a denomination, we're very proud of the ways we provide, and networks of food banks and warm spaces and the like. But one of the passions, certainly for Ruth and I, in our work in this chapter and beyond, has been actually raising the question of how much that's still trapped in a colonial mindset. How much kind of holding on to those positions of provider and host actually hampers our participation in the work of justice seeking. How much actually wanting to speak for others again can be a barrier. And so I think, again, the challenge for the church at a local level, for the Church of England, is finding ways of being present that are radically attentive, humbly receptive to the realities, the lives, the voices, the agency of local people, and how we might be, at best, cheerleaders, catalysts, enablers of that kind of power becoming more visible, more audible, more connected and stronger, rather than kind of pushing ourselves to the front of the march, as it were.
Thank you for that. So obviously you co-wrote this chapter with Ruth, so I'm sure she might have her own insight into this.
Sure,
But
she will.
Yes. So what do you hope people will take from your essay?
So I guess we're imagining our primary audience will be people racialized as whites like us, who might be tempted into the kinds of facilitation that we want to kind of critique and raise some concerns about. So we hope that there's certainly a group of people who read it who will, like us, end up looking at their own practice and asking how they might do that differently, how they might step back, how they might acknowledge their own moral ambivalence in spaces like this and in roles like this, how they might show up with their particularities as those racialized as white, and how they might, like us, embrace our limitedness in terms of knowing that there are some things that we can't do, there are some things we can't understand, there are some spaces that we shouldn't expect to have access to. So I think that's one audience and that's one hope. But I guess I hope it's not just those people who read it. I guess I hope there might be insights and interruptions that others might read, those maybe who are not racialized as white, who may notice themselves in some of the spaces between our words, who might hear their voices in some of the Black theorists and theologians that we've tried to pay attention to, and we've tried to be open to the interruptions and challenges from. So I hope there are others who read it that will feel heard and noticed and seen. I mean, I think I tend to caveat all of my writing these days with a kind of a modesty in terms of its ambitions, an awareness that much of what I write as a white person is following after a tradition of Black thought and Black theology, which is hugely more well developed than the parallels among those of us who are conscious of our whiteness and writing from our whiteness. So there's a sense in which I would expect Black readers, if they did bother to read our chapter, to probably be nodding and saying, yeah, we knew that already, you don't need to tell us. But I guess I hope not, as we are quite cautious about, not for reconciliation tomorrow as a result of this chapter or anything else that we write or do, but maybe for a discovery of a little bit more common ground that we can walk on together and that we can acknowledge as holy together.
Thank you, Al. I'm sure people will look forward to reading your chapter, you and Ruth's chapter. We look forward to hearing from Ruth soon. And thank you for speaking about it today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carol.